The Doll's House, Chapter 2. The shortage of dolls' houses was acute. There were a few in the toy shops, but they were very expensive and made of cheap papier-mâché or plywood. "Not worth the money," said the children's father. "They wouldn't last any time." "I want one to last," said Mr. Plantagenet with a catch in his breath. "I want one to last for always." More than anything in the world, Mr. Plantagenet wanted a home. One that will shut, one that will last. "Do you think they will ever buy a house for us?" he asked. Being a doll, he could not say, "Do you think we shall ever buy a house?" He had to wait until Emily or Charlotte or Emily's and Charlotte's father had the idea of buying one for him. Even if they had the idea, these days it was too expensive, and he knew that the money Emily and Charlotte put into his pockets was only gold and silver paper. "I don't think we shall ever have a house," said Mr. Plantagenet. One will come," sang Bertie. "How do you know?" asked Mr. Plantagenet. Bertie could not say how she knew. The thought of it rattled in her head with the thought of the tiny raffia hat that Emily had now found for her. It was no bigger than a half-crown, and Emily had fixed in it a feather from her aunt's canary. Remembering that, Bertie suddenly remembered what she had thought about the house. "Emily fixed the hat," she said. "Someone will fix the house." Of course, there were dolls' house advertised in the newspaper, even sometimes in the part of the newspaper Emily cut up for Mr. Plantagenet. "Doll's house for sale, 4 rooms, fully furnished, electric light, loggia, garage with miniature cars, £25. "That's an enormous heap of money," said Charlotte. "But I don't want electric light," said Mr. Plantagenet. "A little pretending candlestick would do for me, and I wouldn't even know how to drive any kind of car." But even the plain doll's house, 4 rooms, 2 rooms, some furniture, were 7 or 8 or 3 or even 4 guineas each, and neither Emily and Charlotte nor their father had that much money to spare. "We shall never get one," said Mr. Plantagenet. At the moment, the Plantagenets were as uncomfortable as anyone in London. They had to live crowded together in 2 shoe boxes that were cramped and cold and that could not shut. When they hung their washing out to dry, even the smallest pattern duster, it made the cardboard sodden and damp. "You can't play with them properly," wailed Charlotte. "It doesn't feel like home," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Though, of course, it is ever so much nicer than the toy cupboard," he added hastily. "But I'm too heavy for it, and so is Apple. It doesn't feel safe." "I don't mind it," said Bertie. But then Bertie, aggravating creature, never minded anything. She was happy anywhere. "It slips about. Everybody knocks it over. It doesn't feel safe," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Long, long ago," began Tottie in her comforting voice, and it is the best wood that gives out the most comforting voice. Ask the men who make pianos and violins and flutes. "Long, long ago, I knew a doll's house. I lived in it. It belonged to Laura. She was Emily's and Charlotte's great-great-aunt. That was 100 years ago," said Tottie. Tottie had stayed the same all that time, for all that 100 years. Does that surprise you? It is easier for dolls than children. From the moment they are made, finished, they never have to alter. They never have to grow. "I wouldn't be a child for anything," Tottie often said. "First you have to be a baby, then a little child, then a bigger child, then a schoolboy or girl, then a big boy or girl, and then grown up." Of course, Tottie knew she could not, even if she would. There is no power of growing in dolls, and she knew that that was why, for instance, any live little girl, however stupid, had power over her. "I am as I am," said wise little Tottie. "I couldn't be all those things. In all these years, these 100 years, I can still only be me." It is very important for dolls that children guess their right ages, though some thoughtless children make their dolls vary between 6 and 6 months. Mr. Plantagenet, for instance, was born 28 years old. Tottie was about 7. Apple would always be 3. Darner was so cross that it was easy to guess he was old. Bertie was more difficult. It was her flightiness, but even Bertie was easily seen to be between 20 and 30. "I was telling you about the doll's house," said Tottie. "It was not too big. It could stand comfortably on the table, and outside it was glossy, cream-colored, painted with ivy. It looked as good as real ivy," said Tottie. "It would be better than real ivy," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Real ivy chokes things and could even pull down a house. Painted ivy is safer. I like painted ivy. Go on." "Go on, go on," cried Apple. Emily had put him on a chair, but he had deliberately fallen off upside down because he wanted to practice standing on his head. "Don't do that, Apple dear," said Tottie. "The doll's house? Oh, yes. In the front, there was a front door with steps leading up to it." "How many steps?" "6, said Tottie, "and the door was painted green with a knocker. It didn't really open, but that didn't matter because the whole of the front swung open, leaving the inside ready to be played with." "Leaving the steps?" asked Mr. Plantagenet anxiously. "Leaving the steps," nodded Tottie, and she added, remembering, "On the steps was fixed a little tiny scraper." "Would my foot go on it?" asked Apple. "My foot in its red shoe?" "Perfectly," said Tottie. "And yours," she said to Mr. Plantagenet, before he need ask. "There was a kennel," she said, "just outside." "For Darner?" asked Apple. "But would he go into it?" asked Mr. Plantagenet doubtfully. "In this kennel, I think he would," said Tottie. Darner did not growl as he would have if he had thought the kennel was dangerous. He always growled purr-ick at danger. There was a hall with a staircase and a polished wooden floor. "I remember the floor particularly," said Tottie, "because it looked like a draft board. Drafts is a game you play on a board checked in squares of light and dark wood," she explained to Apple. "The walls of the hall were red paper," she said, "that looked like satin." "Are you sure it did?" asked Mr. Plantagenet doubtfully. "I haven't seen any paper like that." "You would have once," said Tottie. "I'm quite certain. I remember it looked cozy and rich. There was a hall window with lace curtains. The white looked pretty on the red. There were Christmas scraps for pictures and clocks glued on the wall and 2 doll's house, dark wood chairs and a tiny rug." "Everything," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Everything." "And in the hall," said Tottie, "was the figure of a butler." No one asked her why she said the figure of a butler instead of a butler. They knew that whoever had made or tried to make that butler had not been successful. There are some dolls like that. There was no need to pity him because he never had been a butler. "We could put him outside," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Go on." "To the left was the kitchen," Tottie went on. "You know which the left is, Apple, your left hand, the one you don't shake hands with. On the left, then, was the kitchen. What was it like? What was it like? What was it like?" There was a blue tin stove with saucepans and a kettle. There was a heavy iron on a stand no bigger than Emily's fingernail. There was a rolling pin and a wooden pudding basin smaller than a thimble. There was a dresser with flowered china cups and plates on it, a table and another rug and kitchen chairs and a mangle and a pot of pretending geraniums on the windowsill. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Plantagenet longingly. Up to now, the thought of the house and the thought of her hat had been knocking together in Bertie's head. Now she asked, "Was there a little feather broom?" "I think there was," said Tottie. "Dear," said Bertie. And the feather broom and the feather in her hat seemed to float before her eyes. "Could you make buns for tea in that kitchen?" asked Apple. "What is a bun?" "To the right of the hall," said Tottie. "You know your right hand, Apple dear, the one you do shake hands with." To the right was a sitting room. It had a green carpet, said Tottie, the color of holly leaves, and it had real wallpaper like the hall, only this one was white with little cream stripes. On the wallpaper were 2 little pictures. Their frames were made of glued-on shells that Laura had picked up at the seaside. There was another window. Did it open? No, it didn't open, but it had lace curtains too, and there was a fireplace and a fire of shining red gelatin paper. There was a sofa covered in red velvet and 2 chairs to match, and a table and a piano. Its notes were paper notes glued on. On the table, said Tottie slowly, was a lamp with a white china shade. It would really light if you used a birthday cake candle. We should have to be very careful of Apple with that candle, said Bertie suddenly, and they all stared at her because that was such an unusually clear thing for Bertie to say. You are right to be afraid of fire, said Tottie. You are celluloid, Bertie, and that would flare up in an instant if you went anywhere near fire. You would, you know, said Mr. Plantagenet. Better not go near the candle, Bertie. I, said Bertie, surprised. I was thinking of Apple. Also on the table, said Tottie, there was a vase of wax roses. They were modeled in wax, and they were no bigger than a thimble. Like the pudding basin, murmured Mr. Plantagenet. Yes, said Tottie, and in the sitting room there was a golden cage, and inside the cage was a bird. A bird? asked Bertie. Ah, did it sing? No, it couldn't sing, said Tottie, but it was there. It could sing, said Bertie, and her eyes seemed to shine. I know how it sang. Scraps and pieces of all the songs she had ever heard knocked together gently in her head with bird song, chiefly sparrow, because she had heard little else, being a London doll. She could not sing any one of them, but they all ran together and seemed to make a chain of song in her head, such as might be sung by a bright toy bird. Ah, sighed Birdie. Music, delicate clockwork, musical box music was what Birdie liked to hear. Upstairs, said Tottie. There were 2 bedrooms. One had a pink flannel carpet and one had a blue. There were beds with nicked round blankets, and there was a white tin bath with taps, and there was a cot with bars. Would it do for me? Asked Apple. It would be a good fit, said Tottie gravely. There was a jug and basin and a pail to match them for carrying the water downstairs. Very thoughtful, said Mr. Plantagenet. Did the taps on the bath really run? Yes, if you put water in the tank behind the bath, said Tottie. Mr. Plantagenet nodded. Apple was thinking about the cot. Birdie was thinking about the bird in the bird cage. Occupied, of course, said Mr. Plantagenet suddenly. Occupied? Asked Tottie. I mean, there are other dolls living in it, of course. It was a long time ago, said Tottie. Maybe it has gone, been sold, or broken up. I don't know where it is now, said Tottie sadly. That Laura, great-great-aunt Laura, had a little girl, but the little girl is a great-aunt herself now. Why, she is Emily and Charlotte's great-aunt. Maybe she has given it away or given it up. I don't know. But dolls lived in it then, said Mr. Plantagenet. You lived in it once. Did other dolls live there with you? Don't you remember them? I remember one, said Tottie slowly. Yes, I remember her, said Tottie very, very slowly. Why do you say it like that? What was her name? Her name was Marchpane. What a funny name. What does it mean? Marchpane is a heavy, sweet, sticky stuff, like almond icing, very old-fashioned, said Tottie. You very quickly have enough of it. It was a good name for her, said Tottie slowly. But what was she like? Asked Mr. Plantagenet. What was she like? Asked Birdie. What was she like? Asked Apple. She was valuable, said Tottie. She was little and heavy. What was she made of? I am made of celluloid, said Birdie, and celluloid knocked in her head against the words like it. Cellophane, cellular, Celanese. Now she did not know which she was made of, but any of them seemed to describe her well. I like you to be made of celluloid, said Mr. Plantagenet quickly, as if he were afraid that what Tottie said might hurt Birdie, but Birdie did not mind. Marchpane was made of kid and china, said Tottie. Kid? What is kid? It is a kind of leather, white leather, said Tottie. Her body was made of it and stuffed with sawdust and jointed. Her joints worked more smoothly than mine. Her head was china, and her eyes were china too. Her hair was real in a plait that they pinned round her head. You could plait it and unplait it. Was it yellow? Asked Birdie. Yes, said Tottie mournfully. Is there much difference between real and unreal? I wouldn't know, said Birdie. Well, yes, said Tottie as gently as she could. Did her clothes take off and on? Asked Apple, who hated to have his clothes taken off. She was in a wedding dress, said Tottie. They took off, and they were all white. White? I shouldn't like that, said Birdie more cheerfully. I like pink and red and yellow and blue. But they were beautiful. They were stitched with tiny feather stitching. Is there a stitch called feather stitching? Oh, I should like that, said Birdie, forgetting Marchpane. And they were edged with narrowest real lace. Brick, said Darner suddenly. They looked at him in surprise. They all looked round for the danger and could not see any. Were those curtains real lace curtains? Asked Mr. Plantagenet. Those curtains in the house? I shouldn't suppose so, said Tottie. Real lace is very expensive. If it were my house, said Mr. Plantagenet, I should have real lace curtains. Nothing less, said Mr. Plantagenet firmly. Think, to live in a house like that. His eyes, that Emily now kept quite free from dust, shone, being glass, they shone quite easily. Not to live in a shoebox any more. His voice changed as he said that. He sounded as if he were shut in the dark toy cupboard again. I could get out of my cot, said Apple suddenly. I would. I could climb through the bars, and Emily and Charlotte would think I had rolled out. Birdie was thinking about the bird, her song, her hat, its feathers, feather stitching, the feather broom. And when they had finished playing with us, said Mr. Plantagenet, they would shut up the front and we should be alone, quite private, in our own house. Yes, said Tottie, I had forgotten how good that can be. She had forgotten marchpane as well. End of chapter 2.